My nephew accused me of something awful, which turned out to be false, and I made sure there were consequences for that. Here's the story. I'm a 37-year-old woman, and I've always been deeply supportive of my family, especially my 13-year-old nephew. His father, my brother, has struggled since losing his wife a few years ago. I've stepped in to help with financial support, ensuring my nephew didn't lack anything. To me, that's just what family does. The day it all happened started normally. I was heading home after work, looking forward to relaxing and maybe watching some TV. But as soon as I stepped through the door, I could tell something was wrong. My phone was buzzing constantly with missed calls and messages from my brother. The messages were vague, just saying I needed to answer because it was serious and I was in trouble. Without context, I shrugged it off at first, assuming it was another one of his financial issues since I had bailed him out before. I planned to return the call later, after I'd had a moment to settle in. An hour later, I received another call, this time from an unknown number. Assuming it was a spam call, I picked up anyway, only to hear a voice introducing themselves as a detective and asking me to come to the station. I felt a wave of dread, that gut-wrenching feeling when you sense something's horribly wrong but have no idea what. I asked what was going on, but the detective wouldn't say over the phone, only urging me to come down as soon as possible. So I grabbed my keys and headed straight to the station, running through every possible reason they might want to see me, but nothing seemed to make sense. At the station, they led me into a sterile interrogation room that felt like something out of a crime show, cold and impersonal. A detective sat across from me, looking dead serious, and asked if I knew why I was there. I said no, but my mind was racing, trying to piece it together. Then she told me my nephew had made severe accusations against me. At first, I just stared, unable to process what I was hearing. When she repeated the allegations, I felt as though I'd been punched in the stomach. What he accused me of was something so horrific. I couldn't even bring myself to say it aloud. It was utterly shocking, and I was frozen in disbelief. My immediate reaction was to deny it, insisting to the detective that this had to be a mistake. I told her I'd never do such a thing and couldn't believe my nephew would say something so terrible. This was a boy I'd helped raise since his mom passed. It didn't make any sense. But the detective was looking at me like I was guilty, as if they'd already decided my fate. She mentioned they'd spoken to my brother, who was fully backing his son. That stung, but more than anything, it left me bewildered. Why would my brother support such an accusation? Where was all of this coming from? I was panicking. It's one thing to hear accusations behind your back, but to face them from a detective in an interrogation room is a nightmare. The detective kept pressing, asking if I had anything to hide or wanted to confess to anything. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, like this was some twisted dream. Eventually, they asked if they could search my house, making it sound like I didn't have a choice. I agreed, as I had nothing to hide, but the idea of them going through my home, as though I were a criminal, was nauseating. After hours of questioning, they finally let me go, but they didn't clarify much. The detective just told me to stay available for follow-up. I left in a daze, my mind spinning with unanswered questions. How did it come to this? Why would my nephew say something so vile? And why was my brother standing behind him? When I got home, the full weight of it all hit me. This accusation could destroy my life. My career, my relationships, everything I'd built could collapse over a lie. I paced around my house, replaying the events over and over, searching for some logical explanation, but I kept coming up empty. My nephew and I had never had issues. In fact, we were close. I'd spent countless hours supporting him and being there whenever he needed someone. It didn't add up. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the detective's face and heard my nephew's accusation echoing in my mind. The sheer injustice of it gnawed at me, and I swung between rage and disbelief. How could family betray me like this? Why would someone I trusted do something so cruel? I kept hoping there was some simple misunderstanding that would clear this up, but a part of me was beginning to fear the worst. My brother's behavior, his quick support of this lie, it all seemed too deliberate, too calculated. This wasn't just a misunderstanding or a mistake. It felt like a direct assault, an intentional attempt to ruin me. The next morning, I called in sick to work, too drained and distracted to even pretend to be productive. As I sat there, staring blankly at my phone, I realized I had a decision to make. I could try to push through, hoping this would all blow over. Or I could start fighting back, digging into why they were doing this and uncovering the truth. I had no idea what I might find, but I was determined to find out. After that grueling interrogation, I was left completely shattered. I couldn't eat, sleep, or focus on anything but the accusations my nephew had made against me. I tried to make sense of it, but every thought only led to more frustration and confusion. How could a child I had supported so much turn against me like this? And why would my brother, my late sister's husband, back him up on something so outrageous? The worst part was that the police didn't just brush it off after he spoke. They were treating it seriously, investigating me as if I'd actually done what he claimed. It all felt insane. Sitting there in my own home, my life now clouded with suspicion, everything around me seemed tainted. I couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was happening, that there was a missing piece I hadn't figured out. It didn't feel like a kid making a careless remark. It felt orchestrated, as though there was a reason behind it. But why? Then, out of the blue, I got a call from the detective on my case. He informed me they needed to bring my nephew in for another interview, this time without his father present. That caught my attention. I didn't know why they'd separate them, but if the police sensed something was amiss, that was a small glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this would get resolved. I have no idea what happened in that room during his second interview, but a few hours later, I received a call that changed everything. The detective sounded different, as if he was finally on my side. He told me my nephew had confessed to making up the accusation. I felt the breath leave my body. He made it up. Of course, I'd wanted it to be false, but hearing it confirmed was overwhelming. I felt a strange mix of relief, anger, and pure betrayal. I asked why he'd lie like that, but the detective couldn't share all the details over the phone. All he told me was that my nephew's mom, my late sister's sister, had pressured him into it. Hearing that was indescribable. There's a saying about blood being thicker than water, but in that moment, it felt like my family had thrown me away without a second thought. My sister-in-law had pushed her own son to lie, to say something so devastating about me. For what? It made no sense. When I met with the detective in person, he laid everything out. My nephew had confessed that his mom told him to accuse me because they needed money, and she thought this would be an easy way to blackmail me. Their plan was to trap me, to make me so terrified of the damage to my reputation that I'd pay up, stay quiet, and protect myself. I sat there in shock, every word feeling like a stab in the back. I'd always known my brother had financial struggles after my sister passed. That's why I had stepped in to help, buying groceries, clothes for my nephew, and offering a little extra now and then to keep them stable. And he turned that generosity against me, using it to try to squeeze even more money out of me. The detective explained that, in his statement, my nephew admitted he'd tried to resist at first. He knew it was wrong and was afraid, but his dad told him they had no other option, that this was the only way. Imagine that a 13-year-old being told by his own father to do something so awful because it was their only choice. I was disgusted. I'd always thought I knew my brother. He was family, my sister's husband, and when she passed, I felt it was my duty to be there for them. But hearing how he'd manipulated his son to say something that could ruin my life, I couldn't wrap my mind around it. How desperate, how selfish do you have to be to put your child through that? The detective asked if I'd ever suspected he was in such severe financial trouble. I honestly told him that my brother had mentioned money issues before, but never anything this extreme. He was always vague, saying he might need a little help, nothing that hinted he'd go to such lengths. I'd helped him out before, but I never imagined he'd turn on me like this. My hands were shaking, my mind racing. I kept thinking about all the times I'd trusted him, welcomed him into my life, my home, and now, knowing he was capable of this level of betrayal, it was unreal. I'd heard of people backstabbing each other over money, but this was my family. I never thought it would happen to me, especially from the very people I'd bent over backward to help. And then there was my nephew. I didn't know what to feel about him anymore. Part of me pitied him. After all, he's just a kid. But he still went along with it, still let those words come out, knowing what they could do to me. I couldn't stop picturing his face, the child I'd helped raise, now forever tied to a lie that nearly destroyed my life. The detective told me they'd follow up with my brother, but he couldn't guarantee anything. Even with my nephew's confession, it would be difficult to prove my brother's involvement if he denied it. I was furious, but felt powerless. The thought that he might avoid punishment for all this made me feel sick. I thanked the detective, shook his hand, and left the station. I walked home in a daze, still struggling to process everything. I felt torn on one side. I was relieved that my name had been cleared, that the lie had been exposed, but on the other, I was filled with rage and heartache. This was my family, my flesh and blood, who had tried to destroy me for money. When I got home, I sat in silence, replaying every moment in my mind. The relief of proving my innocence was there, but it was buried under layers of anger, betrayal, and pain. I didn't know what to do next. All I knew was that things would never be the same. After finding out the truth from the detective, I could barely hold myself together. The fact that my brother had gone so far as to use his own son to frame me is impossible to describe. The shock, the fury, the betrayal, it all hit in waves. But at the core of it, I knew what I had to do. I had to face him. There was no way I could let this slide without hearing whatever excuse he'd come up with for thinking this was even remotely acceptable. I didn't bother calling him first. I drove straight to his place, my thoughts racing the entire way. I kept recalling every moment from the past few years, every time I'd helped him out, every dollar I'd given to keep them afloat, only for him to turn around and do this. My anger was boiling over, and I wasn't even sure what I'd say when I saw him. All I knew was that I needed answers. When I arrived, he opened the door, looking surprised but not even slightly afraid, which somehow fueled my anger further. He just stood there, as if he hadn't tried to destroy my life. I barely restrained myself from blowing up on the spot. Instead, I looked him straight in the eyes and said, "We need to talk." Now he tried to play it cool, giving a fake smile and offering me a seat, as if this were some ordinary conversation. I wasn't playing along. "Why?" I asked, diving straight to the point. "Why would you do this? Why would you push your own son to lie about something this serious for a second?" He looked caught off guard, like he hadn't expected me to be so blunt, but then he regained composure and let out this exaggerated sigh. "Look," he started, "you don't get it. It's been hard. I'm a single father, and things have been tough since your sister passed. You have money, and I don't." "Stop," I cut in. I didn't want to hear his excuses. "You tried to ruin my life. You made your son accuse me of something disgusting. Do you even realize what you were doing?" He crossed his arms defensively, looking away. "I didn't have a choice," he muttered, still refusing to meet my eyes. "You're well off, and we're struggling." I was desperate, okay? Desperate people do desperate things. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Desperate people do desperate things? That's your justification. You thought dragging my name through the mud was okay because you were short on cash. I practically yelled. "I've helped you every single time you asked, and this is how you repay me." He rolled his eyes, which only made my anger flare more. "Oh, please," he said. "You act like you've done so much for us, but a few handouts here and there don't solve all my problems. I needed real help." I couldn't help but laugh at how absurd this was. I've paid for groceries, clothes, school supplies, you name it. How much more help were you planning to squeeze out of me? He didn't respond, but his jaw tightened, and he finally looked up, clearly irritated. "It's easy for you to talk," he snapped. "You don't know what it's like to struggle day after day. I thought maybe if I scared you a little, you'd finally give us what we actually need." Scare me, the word echoed in my mind. You wanted to scare me into giving you money by having your son accuse me of something unforgivable? Do you realize how messed up that is, or have you completely lost touch with reality? His face hardened, and he said, "It wasn't supposed to go this far. I thought you'd just pay up quietly, maybe feel bad enough to support us long term. I didn't mean for it to spiral like this." Spiral, I could feel my pulse pounding. "You told your son to accuse me of a crime, a crime. Did you even stop to think about what that would do to me?" Or to him, he looked away again, saying nothing. It was as if he'd built a wall around himself, blocking out any guilt or regret for the destruction he'd nearly caused. He just kept mumbling about how difficult his life was, as if that somehow excused everything. "I trusted you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I trusted you, and I trusted him. I've tried to be there for you both since my sister passed, and you used that against me. You turned your own son into a tool for blackmail. Do you even hear yourself?" He scoffed, finally meeting my eyes with a defiant look. "Fine. Maybe it was a little extreme, but like I said, desperate times call for desperate measures." I shook my head, feeling a mix of anger and disgust that I couldn't even put into words. There's a big difference between being desperate and being cruel, I said, and what you did was cruel. You tried to ruin my life for money, and you dragged your own child into it. He didn't respond, he just crossed his arms and stared at the floor, like a sullen child who'd been scolded. That's when I realized nothing I said would get through to him. He'd convinced himself he was the victim, that his actions were somehow justified because he was struggling. You know what I finally said, unable to hold back the bitterness in my voice? We're done. Don't call me for money. Don't ask me for help. From now on, you're on your own. That seemed to snap him out of his sulk. He looked up, eyes wide, and started protesting. But what about my son? He needs stability. He needs a father who won't use him as a weapon, I shot back. And clearly that's not you. You've shown that you're willing to use him as a pawn if it benefits you, so no, I won't be there to clean up your mess. He tried to guilt trip me, claiming I was being too harsh and that my nephew shouldn't suffer for his mistakes. But I'd had enough. I told him I wasn't backing down and walked out. For the first time, I felt like I could actually breathe. The confrontation didn't bring me closure, though. If anything, I left feeling even more bitter. My brother-in-law had twisted things to make himself the victim, as if his struggles somehow made all this justifiable. And the worst part? He still didn't grasp the damage he'd almost inflicted. I realized then he didn't care about me or his son, he cared about getting what he wanted, no matter the cost. When I got home, I felt drained. I thought facing him would bring me some kind of peace, but instead, it just made me see how deeply he had betrayed me. It was as if a switch had flipped, and I finally saw him for who he really was, a manipulative, selfish person who'd do anything to get his way. I wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but one thing was clear: I could never trust him again. This wasn't just for my sake, it was for my nephew's too. That kid needed a hard lesson, a way to understand that actions have consequences, even when they come from someone you trust. I hoped it might be a wake-up call for my brother-in-law as well, although, truthfully, I doubted he'd ever fully grasp it. The following weeks were tense. The police needed to go through everything again, taking my statement in even more detail and asking about times I'd helped him financially in the past. It forced me to relive memories I'd rather forget, and it was painful. But I reminded myself why I was doing this. It wasn't just for me, but to prevent him from harming anyone else. I had to protect myself and anyone else he might target. Finally, the day arrived. The police showed up at his house and arrested him. I thought I'd only feel relief, but the reality of it struck harder than expected. This was still family: my late sister's husband, my nephew's father, and now he was being taken away in handcuffs because of his own actions. Yet the memory of how close he came to destroying my life kept me grounded. He had done this to himself. Naturally, word of his arrest got around. Family chatter spread quickly, and soon, I was getting calls from relatives questioning my decision, some even saying I should have just let it go. But I explained everything: the accusation, the blackmail, and, for the most part, people began to understand. Some still felt I was too harsh, but others were stunned, especially when they learned he'd used his own son in the scheme against me. One relative told me, "You did the right thing. People need to know there are consequences." Hearing that was a relief, knowing a few people understood my perspective. The day after his arrest, I couldn't stop thinking about my nephew. I knew CPS would step in, and he'd likely end up in temporary care. Part of me felt guilty, responsible somehow, but I reminded myself he'd been manipulated too. I couldn't shield him from the fallout, but maybe this would be his chance to see things more clearly, to recognize that his father's actions weren't okay. Still, it hurt. I'd treated him like my own, and he'd gone along with his dad's plan without considering the impact on me. That's not something you simply get over. In the weeks that followed, I focused on rebuilding and trying to return to some semblance of normal. But the whole ordeal had left a mark. I was more cautious now, more guarded. Family didn't mean the same thing it once had. I learned the hard way that loyalty can be one-sided, and that the people you trust can betray you for reasons you'll never fully understand. Looking back on my decision to press charges, I had no regrets. I did what I needed to do to protect myself, and maybe, in a way, I helped my nephew too. I hoped that one day he'd understand that his father had taken advantage of both of us, a lesson he'd never forget. In the days after the arrest, I felt like I was in a strange state, part relief, part regret, and a lot of lingering anger that hadn't quite dissipated. My family was divided. Some thought I'd done the right thing, while others felt I'd gone too far by pressing charges, saying I should have let it slide. It was ironic everyone had opinions, but no one truly understood what I'd been through. I tried not to let it get to me because, at the end of the day, I knew my reasons. I couldn't let what he did go unpunished when he'd come so close to destroying my life. Honestly, I hoped it would serve as a lesson for my nephew too, though knowing that didn't make it easier. Returning to work was odd. I felt as if there was an invisible label on me, like everyone could sense what I'd endured, even if they didn't know the details. I knew it was all in my head, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I was hyper-aware in every interaction, wondering if people were whispering behind my back. My boss and a few close friends knew the full story, and they were supportive, which helped. But I still felt a dark cloud hovering over me. Each day, I replayed everything in my mind, wondering if I could have done something differently. Could I have prevented this? Should I have been more cautious with my brother-in-law, maybe less trusting? It was strange before this. I'd always believed in being generous, especially with family. But now, I was questioning it all. Had I been naive, too quick to offer help? I thought of myself as a good person, but I started to realize that sometimes being the good guy just makes you an easy target. About a week after the arrest, I received a call from a family friend who'd heard bits and pieces of what happened. She told me my nephew was staying in a temporary foster home, and I felt a pang of guilt I couldn't ignore. I knew he'd been manipulated and put in an impossible situation by his father, but it didn't erase the fact that he'd gone along with it. Still, knowing he was alone in foster care hit me hard. No child should have to go through that, even if they were part of something so wrong. Part of me wanted to reach out, to offer some kind of support, maybe contact him through CPS or see if there was a way to check in. But each time I considered it, I felt a wall of anger rise within me. I wasn't ready to forgive, not yet. Maybe one day, but the wounds were too fresh. And besides, I wasn't even sure what good it would do. He needed time to understand the weight of his actions, and I needed time to heal. Update: a few months had passed since everything happened with my brother-in-law, and for the first time in a while, I felt like life was settling down. I'd put some distance between myself and the whole mess, and although the betrayal still stung, I was learning to manage it, to stop letting it consume my every thought. Life was finally starting to feel somewhat normal again, or as normal as it could after going through something like that. Then, one afternoon, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, as I'd been ignoring unfamiliar numbers, figuring they were either telemarketers or family members trying to stir things up again. But something about this call made me pick up. The voice on the other end was calm and professional. "Hello, is this my name?" "Yes," I replied, still cautious. "Who's this?" "This is Sarah from Child Protective Services. We have your nephew in our care and wanted to speak with you about a possible option." Hearing that, I felt a wave of shock and braced myself for whatever was coming next. She explained that my nephew had been in temporary foster care since my brother-in-law's arrest. Apparently, they'd reached out to other family members, but either they hadn't met the requirements or weren't interested in taking him in. So now, they were calling me to see if I'd consider temporary custody. I don't know, I stammered, feeling a surge of emotions I wasn't ready to confront. "I'm not sure I'm the best option." Sarah gave me time, allowing me to process. She explained that my nephew's situation was complicated, that he'd been through a lot with his dad, and that his home environment hadn't exactly set him up for success. She spoke with a tone of understanding, even sympathy, like she recognized how difficult this was for me. Maybe she did. She'd probably dealt with cases like this before. "Look," she said after a pause, "I'm not asking for a decision right now. This is a tough situation, and I understand there's been a lot of turmoil. But as a family member, you could offer him some stability, even if only temporarily." I told her I'd think about it, and we agreed to talk again in a few days. After I hung up, I just sat there, staring at nothing, trying to absorb it all. The thought of taking him in felt overwhelming. Part of me wanted to help. He was just a kid, and he'd been through a lot himself. But another part couldn't ignore the pain and betrayal of what he'd done, even if his mom had pressured him into it. The next couple of days were a blur. I couldn't concentrate at work or sleep well either. The decision loomed over me, making everything else feel trivial. I kept going back and forth, trying to balance my options. On one hand, he was still my nephew despite everything. I'd watched him grow up, remembered birthdays, holidays, and the times I'd brought over groceries and gifts when his mom was struggling. I cared for him almost like he was my own. and I couldn't deny a part of me still wanted to protect him, to give him a chance for a better life. I tried to convince myself that, in a supportive environment, he could overcome his mother's influence. But on the other hand, I couldn't forget what he'd done: the accusations, the investigation, the sleepless nights filled with constant anxiety, feeling like I was on trial in my own life. The memory of how he'd looked at me with that cold, rehearsed expression, saying things that had nearly torn my life apart, it was hard to see him as just an innocent kid after that. Even though I kept telling myself he'd been manipulated, the damage remained. I knew he'd been following orders, but that didn't make the hurt go away. My friends had mixed reactions. Some told me it wasn't worth reopening that wound, that it would be too painful and risky to bring him back into my life. Others said maybe this was a chance to make a difference, that if I took him in, I could be the positive influence he needed. But none of them knew what it felt like to have someone you trusted almost ruin your life. They hadn't been through that level of betrayal. Finally, I agreed to meet him. CPS set up a supervised visit at their office, and I showed up feeling nervous and uncertain. When I walked in, he was sitting there, looking smaller and more fragile than I remembered. His eyes flicked up to mine, and for a moment, I saw a hint of fear, maybe even guilt. He mumbled a hi, barely looking at me. I sat across from him, unsure of what to say. He seemed different, more closed off, almost as if he'd built walls around himself that I wasn't sure I could break through. But then I realized I was doing the same, sitting there guarded, my instincts screaming to protect myself. I cleared my throat and managed to ask, "How are you holding up?" It was all I could think of. He shrugged without meeting my eyes. "It's okay, I guess." Different after a pause, he added in a barely audible whisper, "I'm sorry." Hearing that, I felt something twist inside me. I'd been waiting for an apology, hoping he'd own up to everything that happened. But now that he'd said it, it felt hollow, or maybe it was me who felt empty. I wasn't even sure anymore. We sat there in silence, both of us awkward and unsure. When the visit ended, CPS asked if I'd made a decision. I told them I needed a bit more time, but on the drive home, I realized I already knew my answer. I wanted to help him, I really did. But I also knew that having him in my life, under my roof, would constantly remind me of everything I'd been through. I'd always question whether I could trust him, whether he was truly sorry, or just saying what he thought I wanted to hear. And that's not how a home should feel. A few days later, I called Sarah back and gave her my decision: I wouldn't be taking him in. It wasn't an easy choice, and it certainly wasn't the one I ever thought I'd have to make. But after everything that had happened, I needed to protect myself too. I hoped he'd find a place where he could learn from this experience, where he could start fresh without the weight of his mother's choices holding him back. Saying goodbye to family is never easy, but sometimes you have to let go to move forward.